A roided-up bouncer threw me out for causing trouble, not knowing I owned the building. The bouncer's forearm pressed into my throat hard enough that I tasted copper. My feet barely touched the ground as he dragged me backward through the crowd, his other hand crushing my shoulder with fingers that felt like steel cables. People were filming. The bass from the DJ booth rattled my skull as he threw me face first into the brick wall of the alley, and I heard my phone crack against the concrete when it fell from my pocket. "Quote 1, he said, his voice chemically deep, veins bulging from his neck like garden hoses. "Quote 2. Then he went back inside my own building and locked the door behind him. I'd inherited the property 8 months earlier when my uncle died, a 4-story mixed-use building in the revitalized warehouse district downtown. The ground floor housed Apex nightclub, a place that had been struggling when I took over but was now pulling decent crowds on weekends. I was 28, worked in software development, and had zero experience as a landlord. My uncle's attorney, Douglas Brennan from Brennan and Associates, had walked me through the basics during probate. The building had 3 commercial tenants and 6 residential units above. Apex had a 5-year lease with 2 years remaining, paying $8,500 monthly plus a percentage of bar sales over $50,000. The contract was standard except for one detail buried in an addendum that I'd barely glanced at during the endless paperwork signing. They had operational control of their space, including security decisions, as long as they maintained insurance and followed fire codes. I'd visited the club once during my first month as owner, introduced myself to the manager, a guy named Cameron who seemed competent and professional. He'd given me the tour, shown me their updated sound system, and the new LED panels they'd installed. Everything looked legitimate. The residential tenants paid on time through direct deposit. The other commercial spaces, a coffee shop and a boutique gym, had no complaints. Being a landlord felt almost passive, just collecting checks and approving repair requests through my property management app. I figured I'd gotten lucky with a turnkey situation. That assumption lasted until I stopped by the club on a Saturday night in October, planning to grab a drink and see how the business was doing firsthand. The line stretched halfway down the block when I arrived around 11. I walked past it toward the entrance, assuming I could explain to whoever was checking IDs that I owned the place. That's when I first saw him. The bouncer stood 6'5" easily, his neck as thick as my thigh, wearing a black compression shirt that looked vacuum-sealed to his chemically enhanced physique. His arms were covered in tribal tattoos, his jaw set in a permanent scowl, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the night. A brass nameplate on his chest read, I approached with my hand extended, ready to introduce myself. He placed his palm flat on my chest and shoved me backward hard enough that I stumbled into the couple behind me. "Quote 4, he said, his voice rumbling from somewhere deep in his steroid-swollen chest. I regained my balance and tried to explain who I was, but he'd already turned away, letting a group of women in short dresses pass the velvet rope without checking anything. I decided not to make a scene in front of 50 people filming with their phones. Professional landlords probably didn't get into sidewalk confrontations with their tenants' employees. I walked to the back of the line, figuring I'd talk to Cameron once I got inside and clear up the confusion. The wait took 35 minutes. By the time I reached the front again, a different bouncer was checking IDs, a smaller guy with a tablet who seemed focused on matching faces to names on some kind of list. I handed him my driver's license. He scanned it with a portable reader, then looked up at me with confusion. "You're not on the list," he said, apologetic. Before I could respond, the massive bouncer appeared beside him, plucking my ID from his coworker's hand. He studied it for a moment, then looked at me with something that might have been recognition, but felt more like calculation. Quote, "Shot 6. He said slowly, as if speaking to a child. Quote, "Shot 7. I assured him it wasn't, that I'd be happy to provide additional identification if needed. He handed the license back and stepped aside. The club was packed, maybe 300 people crammed into a space that probably maxed out legally at 250, according to the fire code placard I remembered seeing during my daytime visit. The air was thick with fog machine smoke and synthetic vanilla from the vape clouds. I pushed through the crowd toward the bar, planning to order something and then find Cameron to discuss the door situation. That's when I noticed the VIP section had been modified. During my first visit, it had been a roped-off area with maybe 10 tables. Now it took up nearly a quarter of the floor space, separated by velvet curtains and elevated platforms that definitely hadn't been there before. Structural modifications required landlord approval per the lease terms. I'd received no such request. I found Cameron in his office, a converted storage room near the kitchen. He seemed surprised to see me, standing quickly from behind his desk, covered in cash counting machines and deposit bags. "Hey, didn't know you were stopping by," he said, his smile tight. I mentioned the door situation, keeping my tone casual, trying not to sound like I was complaining. He nodded sympathetically, explained they'd recently hired additional security due to some incidents with fake IDs and underage drinking. The city had sent an inspector after a complaint, so they were being extra cautious now. He apologized for any confusion and offered me a comp tab at the bar. I accepted, figuring the relationship was salvageable, but mentioned I'd noticed the VIP section looked different. His expression shifted slightly, defensive, but controlled. "Minor aesthetic changes," he said. "Nothing structural, just decor and lighting. The lease allows for interior modifications that don't affect building integrity." I didn't push it. Technically, he might have been right, depending on how the contract language was interpreted. I made a mental note to have Douglas review the lease in detail and headed back out to the floor. The bouncer watched me from his position near the entrance, arms crossed, his jaw working on something, probably gum, though the rhythmic grinding suggested something else. I grabbed a drink at the bar, stayed for about 20 minutes watching the operation, then decided to call it a night. When I tried to leave through the main entrance, the bouncer blocked my path, he said, pointing toward a hallway I hadn't noticed. I explained I'd just come in this way and preferred to leave through the same door. He stepped closer, using his size to crowd me backward. Quote 13. He repeated, slower this time, with emphasis that suggested non-compliance wasn't an option. I considered my choices. I was the landlord, technically his employer's employer, but I was also alone in a dark club surrounded by his colleagues and 300 drunk people. Property rights didn't mean much when you were 5'9" and 160 pounds facing a man who probably bench-pressed small cars for fun. I took the back exit. The alley smelled like piss and rotting garbage. As I walked toward the street, I noticed several people clustered near a service door, passing something between them that definitely wasn't cigarettes. They scattered when they saw me, but not before I caught sight of small plastic bags changing hands for cash. Drug dealing in the alley behind my building. Fantastic. I made another mental note to address this with Cameron and possibly the police. My car was parked 2 blocks over. I checked my phone as I walked and found a text from an unknown number, quote 14. The message had been sent while I was inside, probably within the last 10 minutes. I screenshot it immediately and forwarded it to my personal email as evidence, then called Douglas Brennan's emergency line. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding groggy. It was nearly 1 a.m. I apologized for the late call and explained the situation. He listened without interrupting, then asked if I'd been physically threatened or injured. I said no, not exactly, just pushed around and intimidated. He was quiet for a moment, then suggested we schedule a meeting for Monday morning to review the lease and discuss options, he said. Quote 16. I asked what he meant by complicated. He explained that eviction processes could take months even with clear lease violations, and that trying to force the issue might result in expensive litigation. Quote 17. I spent Sunday researching commercial evictions and landlord rights. The deeper I dug, the more I realized Douglas was right about the complexity. Even with clear violations, removing a tenant required extensive documentation, proper notice periods, court filings, and sheriff involvement. If Cameron decided to fight it, the process could easily stretch 6 months or longer. Meanwhile, he'd continue operating and paying rent, giving him time to extract maximum profit while I paid legal fees. The system seemed designed to protect tenants from predatory landlords, which was reasonable in theory, but felt backwards when you were the property owner dealing with what appeared to be criminal activity on your premises. I screenshot everything I found about tenant drug dealing and lease violation procedures, building a research folder that was probably overkill, but made me feel slightly more in control. Monday morning at Douglas's office, I learned the situation was worse than I'd thought. He'd reviewed the lease over the weekend and found several concerning clauses that my uncle had apparently agreed to without much pushback. The operational control provision was broader than standard, giving Apex significant autonomy over security, guest policies, and even minor physical modifications. There was also an arbitration clause requiring all disputes to be settled through a private mediator rather than court, which could work in our favor or against us, depending on who got selected. Most troubling was a section about early termination penalties. If I tried to break the lease without cause, I'd owe them liquidated damages equal to 18 months of rent. That was nearly $150,000. Your uncle wasn't particularly savvy about commercial real estate, Douglas said diplomatically. We discussed possible approaches. The structural modifications to the VIP section might constitute a breach, depending on whether they'd changed load-bearing elements or affected fire exits. The drug dealing in the alley was on my property, but probably not directly attributable to the tenant unless I could prove they knew about it or facilitated it. The threatening text came from an unknown number with no clear connection to Cameron or his staff. The physical intimidation by the bouncer was he said, she said, without witnesses or video. Quote, 19, Douglas said firmly. Quote, 20. He recommended hiring an inspector to evaluate the VIP modifications and possibly a private investigator to document activities at the club. Both would cost money, but less than a protracted legal battle. I contacted an inspector that afternoon, a retired fire marshal named Raymond Torres who specialized in commercial code compliance. He agreed to do a walkthrough later in the week if I could arrange access. I explained that might be difficult given the tenant relationship situation. He'd seen similar cases before, he said. Recommended I exercise my landlord right to inspect the property with appropriate notice. The lease almost certainly included a provision allowing reasonable inspections for safety and maintenance purposes. I checked, and he was right. Section 12.4 allowed landlord access with 48 hours written notice during business hours for inspection purposes. I drafted a formal notice via email to Cameron, stating I'd be conducting a routine property inspection on Thursday at 2 p.m. with a licensed inspector. I kept the tone professional and matter-of-fact, giving no indication this was anything other than standard due diligence. Cameron's response came within an hour. He acknowledged the inspection, confirmed Thursday would work, and mentioned he'd have his head of security present during the walkthrough. The tone was cordial enough, but something about specifically mentioning the security presence felt like a subtle threat. I forwarded the email chain to Douglas, who agreed the phrasing was concerning, but not actionable. He advised. I checked. It did. I set a reminder to fully charge my phone and download a backup recording app just in case. Thursday arrived with gray skies and temperature drops that promised early winter. Raymond Torres met me outside the building at 1:45, a stocky man in his 60s, wearing a windbreaker with his old fire department patch still visible on the sleeve. We reviewed what he'd be looking for: capacity issues, emergency exit obstructions, modifications affecting structural integrity, fire suppression system compliance. The club wouldn't open until 10, so the place should be empty except for cleaning staff and maybe Cameron. We entered through the main door using my key. The interior was dim, lit only by emergency signs and afternoon sun filtering through tinted windows. The smell was stale beer and disinfectant, an improvement over the vanilla fog from Saturday night. The bouncer appeared from the office hallway before we'd taken 10 steps inside. He wore gym clothes instead of his work uniform, compression pants, and a tank top that showed arms veined like anatomical models. His expression when he saw me was something between recognition and contempt. Private property, he said, moving to block our path deeper into the club. I explained I was the building owner conducting a routine inspection per lease terms. He didn't move. Raymond held up his credentials, explaining he was a licensed inspector performing a safety evaluation. The bouncer looked at the ID with exaggerated disinterest. Quote, 25. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email exchange. Quote, 26-6. The bouncer stepped closer, using his size to crowd both of us toward the door. His breath smelled like energy drinks and something chemical, he said quietly. Raymond placed a hand on my arm, a subtle suggestion to de-escalate. I tried one more approach, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline making my hands shake. He smiled at that, a genuine expression of amusement that made my stomach drop. Quote, 29. We called the cops. Officer Jason Reeves arrived 20 minutes later, a patrol officer who seemed annoyed by the call but professional enough to hear both sides. The bouncer's demeanor shifted completely when the uniform appeared, suddenly cooperative and confused by the whole situation. He explained, in a reasonable tone, that Cameron had told him the inspection was rescheduled to Friday due to a scheduling conflict with their accountant who needed to be present. He had no idea I was the building owner, he claimed. He thought I was just some inspector showing up on the wrong day. He apologized for the confusion, offered to call Cameron right now to clear everything up. Officer Reeves looked at me with an expression that said he had better things to do than mediate landlord-tenant disputes. Cameron's voice came through the bouncer's phone on speaker, smooth and apologetic. There must have been miscommunication, he said. He'd sent an email this morning about the rescheduling, but maybe it hadn't gone through. He was actually across town at his accountant's office preparing quarterly taxes. He'd be happy to accommodate the inspection tomorrow at the same time. Would that work? Officer Reeves looked at me expectantly. Raymond checked his phone and nodded, confirming he could do Friday instead. I felt the situation slipping away from my control. Cameron sounded completely reasonable. I looked like a difficult landlord making problems over a simple scheduling mix-up. The bouncer stood with his hands clasped in front of him, the picture of confused innocence. I asked to see Cameron's email about the rescheduling. My phone showed no such message. Cameron's voice came back through the speaker, apologetic again, saying his email had been having issues all morning, something about his server. He could forward the original from his accountant's office if needed. Officer Reeves clearly wanted to leave. Quote 30, he asked, his patience thinning. Quote 31. I agreed to Friday at 2 p.m., confirmed Cameron would be there, and watched the officer leave with barely concealed frustration. The bouncer's smile returned the moment the patrol car pulled away. See you tomorrow, he said, going back inside and locking the door. Raymond and I stood on the sidewalk in the cold. That was rehearsed, he said simply. He was expecting you. The accountant's story, the missing email, all of it. I asked what he thought was really going on. He shrugged, zipping his windbreaker against the wind. Seen this before with commercial spaces. Once tenants establish control, they treat it like their territory, especially clubs and bars. They forget who actually owns the walls. He agreed to come back Friday but suggested I consider bringing legal counsel or at least documentation of the original inspection date. Cover yourself, he said, because they're definitely covering themselves. I spent Thursday evening pulling every email, text, and document related to the property. The original inspection notice, Cameron's confirmation, lease clauses about access rights. I created a formal log with timestamps and screenshots. Douglas reviewed everything and confirmed I was within my rights to conduct the inspection, but he also warned that this was escalating into something that might require more aggressive legal action. Quote 38, he said. Quote 39. He agreed to attend Friday's inspection as my counsel, billing his time at $350 per hour. I didn't care about the cost anymore. This had stopped being about rent collection and started being about who actually controlled my property. Friday afternoon, Douglas met me outside at 1:30. He wore a suit and carried a leather portfolio that looked expensive and intimidating. Raymond arrived at 1:45, and we entered together at exactly 2 p.m. Cameron was waiting in the center of the empty club floor, smiling, hand extended. He wore a button-down shirt and slacks, looking every inch the professional business manager. He apologized again for Thursday's confusion, insisted it was an honest mix-up, offered coffee from their kitchen. Douglas declined politely, explaining we were there strictly for the inspection and would appreciate Cameron's cooperation in accessing all areas of the premises. Cameron agreed immediately, gesturing around the space with pride. The bouncer watched from his position near the office hallway, arms crossed, silent. Raymond began his inspection systematically, checking exit signs, counting occupancy calculations, examining the modified VIP section. He took photos with a professional camera, made notes on a tablet, measured spaces with a laser device. Cameron followed at a respectful distance, answering questions when asked, volunteering information about their improvements and safety measures. Everything seemed cordial. But when Raymond tried to access the storage rooms near the kitchen, Cameron hesitated. He said, Douglas stepped forward. Quote 43. Cameron nodded quickly. Of course, absolutely. Just looking out for his business interests. He gestured to the bouncer, who moved down the hallway and unlocked the storage room door with a key from his pocket. The room was larger than I remembered from my initial tour, maybe 20 by 30 feet, stacked with cases of liquor, boxes of supplies, and what looked like DJ equipment. Raymond entered first, camera ready. The rest of us followed. That's when I noticed the smell, chemical, sharp, distinct. I'd smelled it before but couldn't immediately place it. Raymond noticed too. He stopped in the middle of the room, turned slowly, scanning the ceiling and walls. "Anyone else smell that?" he asked. Cameron's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-adjustment from friendly to wary. He said quickly. Raymond pointed to the ceiling. Quote, 47. He indicated an access hatch partially obscured by a tall shelving unit. Cameron followed his gaze, taking a moment to answer. Quote, 48. Raymond asked if we could move the shelves to access the panel. Cameron smiled tightly. Quote, 49. Douglas made a note in his portfolio. Quote, 50. We completed the walkthrough over the next 40 minutes. Raymond found several issues, occupancy signs showing 250 maximum, when the actual capacity appeared closer to 180 based on square footage, an emergency exit partially blocked by permanent decorative pillars that had been installed without permits, and modifications to the VIP section that included minor electrical work, which required licensed contractor documentation. He explained each violation calmly, photographing evidence, telling Cameron these would need to be addressed to maintain code compliance. Cameron took notes, promised to fix everything immediately, thanked us for bringing it to his attention. As we prepared to leave, Douglas mentioned we'd need to schedule a follow-up inspection within 2 weeks to verify corrections, including access to the storage room ceiling space. Cameron agreed without hesitation, said he'd move the shelving unit before then to make it easier. We left through the main entrance, stepping into late afternoon cold. Raymond waited until we were in the parking lot before speaking. He said. Douglas asked what he thought might be up there. Raymond shrugged. We regrouped at Douglas's office. He laid out our options with legal precision. We now had documented code violations, which gave us leverage but probably wouldn't support immediate eviction. The mysterious ceiling space situation required investigation, but would take more time and possibly law enforcement involvement. We could demand immediate corrections and access, but Cameron would likely comply just enough to avoid consequences while covering up whatever needed covering. Quote, 54. Douglas said, quote, 55. He suggested hiring the private investigator now, someone who could document activities at the club and dig into Cameron's business operations. I agreed immediately, eager to take any action that felt proactive. The investigator was named Lisa Grayson, a former police detective who now ran a small firm specializing in corporate and real estate investigations. Douglas had worked with her before on commercial fraud cases. She met with us Monday morning, reviewing everything I'd compiled. She was in her early 50s, professional and direct, with 23 years of law enforcement experience before going private. Quote 56. She said, quote 57. Her retainer was $5,000, worth every penny if it meant regaining control. Over the next 10 days, Lisa conducted surveillance, photographing people entering and leaving the club at various hours, running background checks on Cameron and his staff, reviewing business licenses and permits, checking police calls to the address. What she found exceeded my worst suspicions. The bouncer, whose legal name was Danny Kovacs, had multiple arrests for steroid distribution and assault, though only one conviction for simple assault that resulted in probation. Cameron himself had filed bankruptcy twice and had been named in 3 previous lawsuits related to unpaid vendors and business fraud. The club had been cited 6 times by the alcohol board for serving minors, each time paying fines but never losing their license. Most concerning, police records showed 38 calls to the address in 8 months, mostly for fights and disturbances, a rate that should have triggered additional scrutiny from the city. Lisa's surveillance photos showed regular late-night activity well after the club's 2 a.m. closing time. Cars arriving at 3 and 4 a.m., people entering through the back alley door, staying for 20 to 30 minutes, then leaving. Some nights saw 5 or 6 such visits, patterns suggesting drug distribution or after-hours gambling. She'd also interviewed several former employees who'd quit within the last 6 months. 2 of them were willing to provide statements, one describing regular cocaine sales in the VIP section with bouncer involvement, another claiming Cameron had forced them to serve obviously intoxicated patrons and had threatened them when they objected. Quote, 58. Lisa said, presenting her findings in a detailed report with photographs and witness statements. Quote 59. Douglas reviewed everything and made his recommendation. We needed to involve law enforcement, but carefully. If I just called the police and reported suspected drug activity, Cameron would likely have warning through his connections and time to clean up. We needed a coordinated approach, bringing evidence to detectives who could open a proper investigation and potentially serve warrants. Lisa offered to make introductions through her former colleagues. She reached out to Detective Raymond Fisher at the city's organized crime unit, a veteran investigator with 30 years on the force who specialized in commercial vice operations. He agreed to meet with us unofficially to review the evidence. Detective Fisher was a large man with gray hair and a mustache that belonged in the 1980s police movies, but his questions were sharp and modern. We met at a diner away from the police station, maintaining discretion. He reviewed Lisa's report carefully, asking clarifying questions about sources and documentation. When he finished, he sat back and stirred his coffee thoughtfully. He said, I asked what he recommended. He explained that the best approach would be continuing documentation while his unit conducted their investigation. He could request my cooperation as the property owner, which would give me legal cover if things escalated. He'd need access to building plans, utility records, anything that might help them understand the operation. In exchange, he'd keep me informed about the investigation's progress within the limits of what he could share. One thing I can tell you, he added, is that these club operations, when they're dirty, they're usually part of something bigger. The drug sales, the after-hours activity, that doesn't happen in isolation. There's usually money laundering involved, maybe organized crime connections. You might own the building, but you've got snakes in the basement. That metaphor stayed with me through the following weeks as Fisher's investigation proceeded. I provided everything he requested, blueprints of the building, utility usage records showing unusual spikes in electricity during overnight hours, historical data about previous tenants. I also had to maintain the appearance of a normal landlord-tenant relationship, which meant continuing to collect rent and not revealing that law enforcement was involved. Cameron's monthly payments arrived on time, electronically transferred as always, each deposit feeling like blood money. I documented every interaction, every email, building a parallel record that Douglas assured me would be valuable if the situation eventually required civil action. The breakthrough came on a Friday night in early December. Detective Fisher called me at 11:30 p.m., his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction. We're executing warrants at your property in 30 minutes, he said. You'll want to be there as the owner, but stay back and let us work. This is going to get complicated. I drove downtown with my heart hammering, arriving to find 3 unmarked police cars parked in the alley behind the building. Detectives in raid jackets were assembling near the back door, preparing equipment. Fisher saw me and waved me over, handing me a copy of the search warrant. It authorized search and seizure related to narcotics distribution, money laundering, and operating an illegal gambling establishment. The entry was swift and professional. 6 detectives went through the back door simultaneously, announcing themselves, securing rooms. I followed at a distance as they moved through the club, which was packed with maybe 200 people who suddenly found themselves in the middle of a police operation. Danny Kovacs was working the door when detectives reached him. He tried to intimidate his way out of it, squaring up like he might fight, but 3 detectives put him face down on the floor before he could escalate. Cameron was in his office counting cash, literally thousands of dollars spread across his desk. The look on his face when Fisher walked in was something between shock and calculation, his brain visibly trying to figure out how much trouble he was in. The storage room search revealed what Raymond Torres had suspected. Behind the ceiling panel, hidden in the plenum space, was a sophisticated HVAC modification creating a controlled environment. Inside that space were 60 marijuana plants in various growth stages, industrial growing lights, ventilation systems, the whole operation. But that wasn't all. They also found processed cocaine packaged for distribution, scales, cutting agents, and documentation suggesting Cameron was supplying multiple locations beyond just the club. The gambling operation was in a separate room I hadn't known existed, accessed through a false wall in what I'd thought was a utility closet. Inside were poker tables, slot machines, and a safe containing more than $80,000 in cash. Fisher documented everything systematically, photographing evidence, cataloging items, reading Cameron his rights. The club patrons were questioned and released, most of them probably just regular people who'd come for drinks and dancing, oblivious to the criminal enterprise operating around them. Danny Kovac was arrested for possession with intent to distribute after they found steroids and cocaine in his locker. Cameron was arrested for multiple felonies related to drug trafficking, money laundering, and illegal gambling. 2 other employees, both bouncers who'd apparently been part of the operation, were also taken into custody. The whole operation took until 4 a.m., evidence teams working through the night while I sat in the cold with Douglas, who'd arrived after I called him, watching my building get processed like a crime scene. "This terminates the lease," Douglas said, reviewing the warrant documentation. "Criminal activity conducted on the premises by the tenant. That's grounds for immediate eviction under the forfeiture clause. We can file for emergency possession first thing Monday." I asked what would happen to the business. He explained that the club was effectively shut down, their license would be suspended pending investigation, and with Cameron facing serious felony charges, there'd be no one to operate it anyway. The equipment and improvements would likely be seized as proceeds of criminal activity. I'd basically be starting from scratch with an empty ground floor, but at least it would be mine again. The aftermath stretched through the winter. Cameron made bail but was prohibited from entering the property. His lawyer tried to fight the eviction, arguing that the criminal charges hadn't been proven yet and that I couldn't terminate the lease based on allegations. Douglas destroyed that argument with documentation showing that the lease specifically prohibited illegal activity and that evidence seized under warrant was sufficient grounds for termination regardless of criminal trial outcomes. The judge agreed, granting emergency possession within 2 weeks. I had locksmith change every lock and hired a remediation company to remove the grow operation and repair the damage. The financial impact was significant, but manageable. I lost 4 months of rent during the legal proceedings and cleanup. The repairs cost $30,000, mostly replacing ceiling panels, HVAC components, and electrical work that had been modified for the grow operation. The marijuana plants and drug paraphernalia had to be destroyed by professional hazmat teams at my expense, another $5,000. But I also recovered the $80,000 found in the safe after Fisher's unit determined it was my property as rent that had been collected but not properly reported. Cameron's criminal trial wouldn't happen for at least another year given court backlogs, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His lawyer was already working on a plea deal. Danny Kovac took a plea agreement within 6 weeks, testifying against Cameron in exchange for reduced charges. He received 3 years probation and mandatory anger management classes. Part of his statement described how he'd deliberately targeted me on that first night I visited, how Cameron had instructed him to make sure the landlord kid felt unwelcome. They'd been running the operation for nearly 18 months, predating my ownership, likely starting while my uncle was too sick to pay attention. The aggressive security presence wasn't about protecting the club. It was about controlling access and intimidating anyone who might look too closely at what they were really doing. I considered multiple options for the empty commercial space. Several legitimate club operators expressed interest, but I'd lost my appetite for nightlife tenants. Instead, I negotiated with the coffee shop owner who occupied the first-floor corner space. She'd wanted to expand for years, but lacked the square footage. I offered her the old club space at a below-market rate in exchange for a 10-year lease and her agreement to manage tenant relations for the building. She accepted immediately, transforming the dark cave of the nightclub into an open, industrial-style cafe with exposed brick and natural light. The revitalization attracted new interest in the residential units, which filled up within 3 months. Lisa Grayson sent me her final report in March, documenting the complete timeline of the investigation. She'd continued gathering evidence even after Fisher's team executed the warrants, building out the full scope of Cameron's operation. Turned out, he'd been running similar schemes at 2 other locations, using the clubs as fronts for drug distribution and money laundering. The total operation likely moved several $1 million over 3 years. My building had been his newest acquisition, chosen specifically because my uncle was elderly and inattentive, easy to exploit. Lisa's report concluded with an observation that stuck with me. Quote, 69. The following spring, I received a letter from Cameron's public defender requesting a meeting. He was preparing for trial and wanted to discuss settlement options related to the civil damages I was considering pursuing. Douglas advised against meeting, explaining that anything I said could be used in criminal proceedings, but he was willing to entertain written settlement offers. Cameron's lawyer proposed a structured payment plan where Cameron would pay restitution over 10 years in exchange for me not pursuing additional civil liability. The offer was laughable, basically asking me to finance his debt while he did whatever minimal prison time he eventually served. Douglas rejected it with a counteroffer. Cameron surrenders all interest in the business equipment and improvements, accepts full liability for damages, and agrees not to contest any civil judgment. His lawyer accepted within a week. By summer, the building was generating 30% more income than it had under the club operation, with more stable tenants and 0 police calls. The cafe became a neighborhood fixture, hosting book clubs and acoustic music nights. The residential units attracted young professionals who appreciated the building's character and the revitalized area. I'd learned more about property management, contract law, and personal courage than any software development project had ever taught me. The experience changed how I approached problems, making me less willing to accept surface-level explanations and more persistent about investigating when something felt wrong. Detective Fisher stopped by one afternoon in June, ostensibly to update me on Cameron's case, but really just to check in. We had coffee at the cafe, and he told me stories about other commercial property cases he'd worked over the years. He said. I asked him what happened to Danny Kovacs. Fisher smiled grimly. Quote 72. The criminal trial finally happened in September, nearly a year after the raid. Cameron pled guilty to multiple felonies in exchange for a 10-year sentence with possibility of parole after 6. The judge accepted the plea but added commentary about how Cameron had abused his position as a business operator to exploit both his customers and his landlord. During the victim impact statement portion, Douglas read a letter I'd prepared describing the financial and emotional toll of discovering your inherited property was being used for criminal enterprise. Several former employees also spoke, describing the hostile work environment and threats they'd endured. Cameron showed no emotion throughout, his lawyer reading a prepared apology that sounded hollow and calculated. I sold the building 2 years later, not because of lingering trauma or fear, but because I'd learned I was better suited to software development than property management. The buyer was a local developer who appreciated the renovations and stable tenant base. I walked away with a 40% profit after expenses, significantly better than I would have done if Cameron had continued operating the club into the ground while skimming money and damaging the property. The experience became a story I told at dinner parties, usually edited for brevity, about the time I accidentally became a landlord to a drug dealer who threw me out of my own building. Looking back now, the most surreal part wasn't the criminal operation or the confrontations, it was how close I came to just accepting the situation. After that first night when Danny shoved me in the alley, I considered walking away, letting Cameron do whatever he wanted as long as the rent checks cleared. The easier path would have been ignorance, collecting monthly deposits and ignoring the warning signs. That would have made me complicit eventually, either legally when authorities inevitably discovered the operation or morally for profiting from illegal activity. Instead, I leaned into the discomfort and challenged people who assumed I'd be too young, too small, or too inexperienced to matter. The building still stands in the warehouse district, the cafe still operates on the ground floor, and somewhere in a state prison, Cameron is probably counting down the days until parole. Danny Kovacs cycled through several more arrests before finally getting sentenced to serious time for assault during a bar fight. The other co-defendants took various plea deals and scattered to different facilities. Detective Fisher retired last year, and Lisa Grayson's investigative firm is thriving with more business than she can handle. Douglas Brennan still practices real estate law and occasionally sends me cases when software clients need help with property disputes. I kept the brass nameplate that read, quote, 73, the one Danny wore that first night. It sits on my desk now as a reminder that authority and ownership aren't about size or intimidation. They're about documentation, persistence, and surrounding yourself with people who know what they're doing when you don't. Every time I see it, I remember the feeling of hitting the concrete in that alley, my phone cracking, the taste of copper in my throat, and Danny's voice rumbling that he'd really hurt me next time. There was no next time, because I didn't fight him in the alley where he had every advantage. I fought him in courtrooms and police reports and documentation, places where being 5'9" doesn't matter and facts carry more weight than muscle. The building is someone else's problem now, but it taught me something valuable about standing your ground when the ground is literally yours. If you made it this far through the story, you've earned the right to hit that like button. It actually helps more than you think.